On the 7th of December 2025, nearly 4 years since Russian forces crossed into Ukrainian territory, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov stood before journalists in Moscow and delivered a statement that should shake anyone still holding on to hope for a quick diplomatic resolution. Russia's objectives in what they call the special military operation remain completely unchanged. Demilitarization, denazification, and protection of territories now absorbed into the Russian Federation, not modified, not softened for negotiations, not adjusted for political reality, unchanged. And if you think this is just posturing, if you believe Putin will eventually compromise when pressure mounts, if you're waiting for some breaking point where Russia accepts less than their stated goals, let me tell you something based on 40 years studying Russian strategic culture and great power conflict. You're going to be waiting a very long time. What we're witnessing isn't a country being forced to scale back ambitions due to battlefield setbacks or international pressure. We're watching a strategic patient adversary pursuing long-term objectives with absolute conviction that time, industrial capacity, and Western political fractures are working in their favor. I've analyzed Soviet military doctrine, studied post-Cold War Russian strategy, and tracked Putin's decision-making for decades. And I can tell you with certainty that Moscow's refusal to budge on core war aims isn't irrational stubbornness. It's calculated strategy based on their assessment that they're winning the war that actually matters, the war of attrition, the war of industrial production, the war of political will. Let me break down what Russia actually wants, why they believe they can achieve it, and what that means for how this catastrophic conflict ends, because the implications are staggering and almost nobody in Western policy circles wants to face them honestly. But before we dive deep, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because understanding Russian strategic thinking isn't academic exercise. It's essential to grasping where this war is headed and what comes next for global security. Here's the narrative Western governments and mainstream media desperately want you to accept. The story they've been selling since February 2022. Russia invaded Ukraine with maximalist objectives, probably planning to capture Kyiv within days, decapitate the Ukrainian government, install a puppet regime, and essentially recreate Soviet control over Ukraine. But that initial plan failed spectacularly. Ukrainian resistance was fiercer than expected. Western military aid poured in. Russian forces were pushed back from Kyiv, forced to retreat from Kharkiv, driven out of Kherson. Russia has been reduced to grinding attritional warfare in the eastern Donbass region, taking small amounts of territory at absolutely devastating cost in casualties and equipment. Meanwhile, Western sanctions have crippled their economy. International isolation has damaged Putin's regime. The Russian military has suffered catastrophic losses, hundreds of thousands of casualties, thousands of tanks and armored vehicles destroyed. Given all this, the narrative continues. Russia will eventually be forced to accept a negotiated settlement on terms far short of their original objectives. Maybe they keep Crimea, which they took back in 2014 anyway. Maybe they get some degree of autonomy for the Donbass republics. But the idea of demilitarizing all of Ukraine, of controlling Ukrainian foreign policy, of dictating government composition in Kyiv, all of that is completely off the table now. This is what you hear constantly from NATO officials, from U.S. State Department spokespersons, from European leaders. They acknowledge the war remains difficult and costly, but they insist Russia is fundamentally weakening, that Ukraine can hold out indefinitely with Western support, that eventually Putin will have no choice but to compromise significantly. It's a narrative built almost entirely on wishful thinking and strategic misassessment, and it's dangerously disconnected from what Russia is actually saying, doing, and achieving. Let me give you the facts that systematically demolish that comfortable Western narrative. First, Russia has never, not once, officially modified or scaled back its stated war objectives. Not after the retreat from Kyiv, not after losing Kharkiv, not after abandoning Kherson. At every stage, through every tactical setback, Russian officials have consistently reiterated that the goals of the special military operation remain exactly what Putin announced on February 24th, 2022. Demilitarization of Ukraine, meaning reduction of Ukrainian military capability to levels that cannot threaten Russian interests. Denazification, their term for removing Ukrainian political leadership Moscow considers hostile and nationalist. And protection of Russian-speaking populations, particularly in territories Russia now claims as part of the Federation. When Western officials or journalists ask about potential compromise or scaling back objectives, Russian officials don't engage with the premise. They reject it entirely. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stated explicitly in August 2025 that Russia's objective isn't just to seize select Ukrainian territories like Donetsk Oblast. It's to obtain political control over all of Ukraine, all of it. Let that sink in for a moment, not just the territories they currently occupy, political control over the entire country. Second, Russia is behaving exactly like a country committed to prosecuting a long-term conflict, not one desperately searching for an exit strategy. They've fully mobilized their defense industrial base for wartime production. Factories that produce civilian goods are now churning out artillery shells, drones, missiles. They've integrated hundreds of thousands of newly mobilized soldiers into their force structure and are training them for extended operations. They've constructed massive defensive fortifications across occupied territories, multi-layered trench systems, minefields, anti-tank obstacles, designed for permanence, not temporary occupation. They've annexed 4 Ukrainian oblasts, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson, integrating them into Russian administrative structures, issuing Russian passports, changing school curricula. These aren't the actions of a country preparing to give back conquered territory. These are the actions of a country planning to keep what it's taken and continue operations until remaining objectives are achieved. Third, and this is absolutely critical to understanding Russian strategy, in every serious negotiation attempt that's been publicly reported or leaked, Russia's demands haven't gotten smaller or more flexible. They've actually expanded and hardened. Before the invasion, Russia demanded written guarantees that Ukraine would never join NATO. Now they demand that, plus formal recognition of all annexed territories, including parts they don't even physically control yet, plus Ukrainian demilitarization with specific force caps, plus restrictions on what weapon systems Ukraine can possess, plus changes to Ukrainian political leadership. In December 2025, Putin stated that Russia aims to achieve all goals of the special military operation unconditionally. Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov reported that Russian forces maintain full strategic initiative and continue advancing along nearly all axes. This isn't a country being forced to compromise. This is a country escalating demands because they assess their position as strengthening, not weakening. Now, let me explain why Russia believes their position is strengthening, because it's crucial to understanding where this conflict is headed. From Moscow's strategic perspective, they're winning the only war that actually matters in the long run, the war of attrition. Yes, they've suffered significant casualties. Estimates range from several 100,000 to over 500,000 killed and wounded. Yes, the war has been far costlier in blood and treasure than they initially anticipated. Yes, they've lost considerable equipment, but here's what Russian planners are looking at. They're systematically degrading Ukrainian military capability faster than it can be reconstituted. Every month, Ukraine loses artillery systems, armored vehicles, air defense platforms, ammunition stockpiles. Some of this gets replaced by Western aid, but never fully, never fast enough. Ukrainian casualties are catastrophic, possibly exceeding Russian losses at this point. Ukraine is now conscripting men in their 50s and even 60s because they've exhausted the pool of younger men willing and physically capable of fighting. Russia has larger population reserves to draw from. They're destroying Western-supplied equipment nearly as fast as it arrives in theater. Every Leopard tank, every Bradley fighting vehicle, every HIMARS system that gets knocked out represents not just a tactical loss, but a strategic depletion of finite Western stockpiles. NATO countries are running low on weapons to send because they never maintained large peacetime inventories, and production hasn't scaled up sufficiently to replace what's been sent plus what's been destroyed. Russia, meanwhile, has converted to full wartime production economy. They're manufacturing artillery ammunition at rates that dwarf combined Western production. They're producing drones in the millions, while Western aid provides them in the thousands. This industrial capacity gap is decisive in attritional warfare. Most importantly, from Russia's strategic view, they see Western political will eroding exactly as they predicted it would. Every debate in the U.S. Congress over aid packages, every poll showing declining European public support for continued assistance, every political leader in Hungary, Slovakia, or elsewhere questioning the strategy, every news report about Ukraine fatigue, Russia sees all of this as confirmation that time is fundamentally on their side. If they can sustain military pressure, which their economy and industrial base currently can, then eventually Western support will decline to levels insufficient to prevent Ukrainian military collapse. Then Ukraine will be forced to accept Russian terms, which will be far harsher than anything currently on offer. Let's examine each of Russia's core objectives in detail, because understanding what Moscow actually wants is essential to evaluating possible end states. Demilitarization means reducing Ukraine's military capability to the point where it cannot threaten Russian interests, Russian-controlled territory, or Russian strategic objectives. Specifically, it means Ukraine cannot possess the kind of military force that could attempt to reclaim Donbass or Crimea by force. Ukraine cannot host Western military bases, cannot deploy long-range strike systems that threaten Russian territory, cannot serve as a platform for NATO operations against Russia, cannot maintain military forces beyond what Russia deems acceptable for purely defensive purposes. In the early 2022 negotiations that briefly took place, Russian demands reportedly included capping Ukrainian peacetime military at 85,000 troops. That's smaller than many European countries, with fraction of Ukraine's population, plus strict limits on heavy weaponry, tanks, artillery, aircraft, and restrictions on missile systems to very short ranges. How does Russia achieve demilitarization? They're doing it right now through sustained military operations, destroying Ukrainian equipment faster than it can be replaced, degrading Ukraine's defense industrial base through strikes on factories, repair facilities, ammunition depots, making the economic cost of maintaining large military forces unsustainable for Ukraine's shattered economy. If you look objectively at what's happening, Russia is making steady progress on this objective. Ukrainian equipment losses are enormous and accelerating. Domestic Ukrainian military production exists, but can't remotely meet demand. Western supplies help but remain insufficient and politically uncertain. Every aid package has to fight through legislative processes and faces increasing opposition. Ukraine's economy is in ruins. GDP has contracted catastrophically. They're dependent on Western financial aid just to maintain basic government functions, let alone sustain a major military. Give this another year or two of continued grinding warfare, and Ukraine's ability to maintain significant military forces without total Western subsidy becomes genuinely questionable. That's demilitarization through industrial attrition rather than decisive battlefield victory, but it's still demilitarization. The second objective, denazification, is more politically nebulous and fundamentally about regime change and political control. Russia uses this inflammatory term, which carries specific historical weight, to mean removing from power Ukrainian political leadership that Moscow considers irredeemably hostile and ultra-nationalist, replacing it with leadership more amenable to Russian interests and willing to maintain Ukraine as a neutral buffer state rather than a Western partner. Essentially, Moscow wants government in Kyiv that they can influence, control, or at minimum trust, not to align with NATO. Now, Russia spectacularly failed to achieve this quickly through military means in 2022. They couldn't capture Kyiv in the opening days. They couldn't decapitate the Ukrainian government. They couldn't generate popular uprising against Zelensky. They couldn't install a puppet regime. But acknowledging that tactical failure doesn't mean they've abandoned the strategic objective. They've simply shifted to a much longer-term approach. The strategy now is to grind down Ukraine militarily and economically until the population loses faith in current leadership's ability to deliver victory or even acceptable stalemate. Wait for Ukrainian domestic politics to fracture under the unbearable strain of endless war, casualties, economic collapse, societal exhaustion. Position themselves to exert significant influence over whatever government eventually emerges in Kyiv, whether through direct control of eastern territories, through economic leverage over a devastated country desperate for reconstruction aid, or through political factions within Ukraine willing to accommodate Russian demands in exchange for peace. This is obviously a much longer play, potentially years or even decades rather than months. But from Russia's perspective, still very much achievable, especially if the war drags on indefinitely and Ukrainian society fractures under accumulated trauma. Putin has already stated he doesn't consider Zelensky legitimate since Ukraine postponed elections. They're constitutionally prohibited during martial law, but Russia uses this as pretext. Moscow refuses to negotiate seriously with the current government, instead waiting for political change that brings more compliant leadership to power. Whether that happens through elections, through political crisis, through military collapse forcing capitulation, or through popular uprising against leaders who promised victory but delivered only destruction, Russia is willing to wait. The third objective, protecting Russian-speaking populations in Donbass and other regions, is largely already accomplished through territorial conquest and annexation. Russia physically occupies Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, plus significant portions of Zaporizhia and Kherson. They've formally annexed all four regions, declared them part of the Russian Federation regardless of international recognition. They're integrating these territories into Russian administrative structures, issuing Russian passports, establishing Russian legal systems, converting currency, reorienting economic ties. From Moscow's ideological perspective, these populations are now protected because they're under Russian control and Russian law. But this objective also provides permanent justification for continued military operations. Any Ukrainian attempt to reclaim these territories, which Ukraine legally considers occupied parts of its sovereign territory, can be framed by Russia as aggression against Russian territory threatening Russian citizens. This gives Moscow perpetual pretext for military response and makes diplomatic resolution extraordinarily difficult because Russia's constitutional claims create domestic political constraints on any Russian leader who might consider returning territory. The fourth objective, preventing NATO expansion to Ukraine, remains the most fundamental from Russia's strategic and security perspective. This is what the war was really about from the very beginning. Russia sees NATO membership for Ukraine as an existential threat, not because they genuinely believe NATO is going to launch unprovoked invasion of Russia, though that narrative plays domestically, but because it permanently cements Western military infrastructure and potentially nuclear weapons on Russia's most vulnerable border, eliminates Ukraine as a buffer state that Russian strategy has relied on for centuries, and represents the final step in what Moscow perceives as deliberate Western encirclement strategy designed to contain and ultimately weaken Russia as a great power. This is the one objective where Russia absolutely will not compromise under any circumstances. They will sustain this war for years, accept enormous costs, risk economic damage, endure international isolation, rather than accept Ukrainian NATO membership. Putin has stated this explicitly and consistently. Western officials who think Russia might eventually accept Ukraine in NATO with certain conditions or after certain timeframes fundamentally misunderstand Russian strategic culture and threat perception. And here's the crucial strategic insight that Western policymakers keep missing. Russia doesn't actually need to militarily defeat and occupy all of Ukraine to achieve this objective. They just need to create conditions where NATO membership becomes practically impossible. By occupying portions of Ukrainian territory, by maintaining frozen conflict with unresolved territorial disputes, by ensuring Ukraine remains politically unstable and partially destroyed, they make NATO membership a non-starter. NATO's own rules state that countries with active territorial disputes or ongoing conflicts cannot join the alliance. That's why Georgia still isn't in NATO 2 decades after their war with Russia. So as long as Russia maintains military pressure on Ukraine, controls disputed territories, and keeps the conflict active, even at low intensity, Ukraine's path to NATO is permanently blocked. From Russia's strategic perspective, that's mission accomplished on the most important objective, even if the war continues indefinitely without formal resolution. Now let's discuss what all of this means for how this war actually ends. Because if Russia's objectives genuinely remain unchanged, and they believe they can achieve them through sustained attrition and Western political collapse, then all the diplomatic efforts and peace plans being proposed are largely meaningless theater. Russia isn't looking for reasonable compromise. They're not interested in splitting differences or finding middle ground. They're pursuing maximum objectives and are willing to fight for years to achieve them. They might make tactical concessions on timing, sequencing, or specific implementation details, but on the core issues, demilitarization, political control, or at minimum regime change, territorial annexation, and permanent NATO exclusion, they're not budging an inch. So what does that mean practically for end states? Several scenarios present themselves based on current trajectories and Russian strategic thinking. First scenario, Ukrainian military capability collapses over the next 12 to 18 months, not necessarily through single catastrophic defeat, but through accumulated attrition that makes continued organized resistance impossible. Units run out of artillery ammunition, air defense missiles, armored vehicles, casualties mount to unsustainable levels, morale breaks, cohesion fractures, large sections of the front begin to crumble. Russia exploits breakthroughs to seize significant additional territory, potentially threatening or even capturing major cities in eastern and southern Ukraine like Kharkiv, Dnipro, or Odessa. Ukrainian government, facing military catastrophe, has no choice but to accept whatever terms Russia dictates. Those terms likely include recognition of all Russian territorial claims, severe restrictions on future Ukrainian military capability, political changes in Kyiv leadership, and ironclad guarantees against NATO membership. Probability of this scenario may be 30% and rising the longer current trends continue. Second scenario, Western military support collapses before Ukrainian military does. Political change in the United States, whether Trump drastically cutting aid or future administration deciding Ukraine isn't worth continued investment. European unity fracturing as populist governments in multiple countries refuse continued support. Economic crisis in Western countries making aid politically untenable. Regardless of specific trigger, aid flow reduces to trickle insufficient to sustain Ukrainian military operations. Ukraine, still capable of fighting but unable to acquire ammunition and equipment necessary for sustained operations, forced to negotiate from position of extreme weakness. Russia, seeing Western abandonment, presses even harder militarily to maximize territorial gains before any ceasefire. Final settlement involves Ukraine accepting most Russian demands, massive territorial losses beyond current front lines, severe demilitarization, and effective neutering as independent geopolitical actor. Probability may be 40 to 45%. This is actually the most likely path based on political trends in Washington and European capitals. Third scenario, some external shock dramatically changes calculations for one or both sides. Economic crisis in Russia severe enough to threaten regime stability, forcing Putin to seek exit. Massive Ukrainian breakthrough, perhaps enabled by sudden influx of game-changing Western technology that threatens Russian control of Crimea or other core territories. Chinese intervention as mediator, with Beijing pressuring Moscow to settle in exchange for increased economic support or other strategic benefits. Major political upheaval in Russia, leadership change, internal crisis. These are all possible but largely unpredictable. Probability may be 15 to 20% for some kind of external shock that fundamentally alters the strategic equation. Fourth scenario, the nightmare case, escalation to direct NATO-Russia military confrontation or nuclear use. Russia employs tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine after major battlefield setback. Ukraine, with or without explicit Western approval, strikes deep into Russian territory with long-range weapons, causing mass casualties. NATO forces enter Western Ukraine ostensibly to provide humanitarian protection, creating direct confrontation. Accidents, miscommunications, or deliberate provocations create incidents that spiral out of control. This remains unlikely. Neither side wants this outcome, but probability isn't zero and increases the more desperate either side becomes. Maybe 5 to 10% and rising if war continues for several more years without resolution. Notice what's absent from all these scenarios. None involves Russia voluntarily compromising on core objectives through negotiations. In every scenario except external shock or escalation to nuclear confrontation, Russia either achieves its goals through military victory, achieves them through diplomatic capitulation by Ukraine under pressure, or continues fighting indefinitely, confident they'll eventually get what they want. This is fundamentally different from what Western strategy assumed would happen. The entire Western approach has been premised on the belief that sufficient military aid, plus economic sanctions, plus international isolation, would eventually force Russia to accept terms short of their maximal objectives. But that's not happening. It's not going to happen unless something fundamental changes in the balance of forces, economic sustainability, or political will. Let me explain why Western strategy has failed to force Russia to modify objectives, because this failure contains important lessons about great power competition and the limits of economic coercion. The West assumed comprehensive sanctions would cripple Russia's economy, force massive contraction, create domestic unrest, make continuing the war economically impossible. Russia's economy did contract initially, GDP fell, inflation spiked,